in the world by having you post a comment. Great to see you all again. My name is Catherine Mattice. I am the founder and CEO of Civility Partners. We are a company focused on building positive, thriving workplaces. And today I have a guest who is on the same mission, but in a different way. So I have Allessandria Polizzi. Hopefully I said that right, your beautiful name.
Yes, you did. A plus.
Perfect. And she has a consulting firm that's focused on resilience and wellness and preventing burnout. And just to tell you a little about her, award-winning HR executive with 30 years of experience, and pivoted her career in 2001 to focus on building solutions. And you are a top 20 workplace wellness provider. So thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So first of all, just tell us a little bit about what your consulting work entails and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, so we really focus on providing a solution to help organizations thrive and address mental health in the workplace proactively by building skills and capabilities based on the latest in scientific research. So we have a training on how to be more resilient, understanding yourself and how you respond to stress, how leaders can be more resilient, and then how organizations can be resilient, implementing and understanding psychological hazards and risks and interventions. And so the work we do aligns with multiple frameworks. Just today, the U.S. Surgeon General came out with a framework for mental health at work. A few weeks ago, the World Health Organization came out with guidelines for mental health at work. And then last summer, ISO, the International Standards Organization, came out with ISO 45003, which also focuses on psychological health and safety. So our program helps companies, organizations implement all of those frameworks in their businesses.
Awesome. It's always kind of fascinating to me that it's like only just now are we talking about mental
Weird.
health.
We have humans at work. Let's treat them like machines. That makes much more sense. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, you've been working with leaders for 30 years. What are some of the challenges that you see with them?
This is actually why I began this work. I was doing research. I had burned out and I was researching this for myself. And I came across the concept of self-coaching versus self-criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've taught leaders for 20, 30 years. I've been in leadership development for huge companies. We've never taught anybody about self-coaching versus self-criticism.
Mm-hmm.
We talk at leaders and we put a lot of pressure on them to be vulnerable, be empathetic, be all these things. But we never teach them how. We never teach them what to do with the things that they need.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that in the research around leaders and leader capability, decades worth of research, there are proven stressors, well known in the academic world, that we never talk about in the workplace. So something like loneliness is a huge problem for leaders. It's particularly the higher up you go.
Yeah.
And yet I've never seen us really speak about that.
That's a great point. There's actually one of my previous guests just wrote, I think he thinks, based on his research, one of the first and only books on loneliness at work. It's called Connectable, I believe. So it's not necessarily focused on leaders specifically, but that's a good point. If it's lonely at the top, but we don't really talk about it. What are some of the other stressors?
Gathering feedback, getting feedback and input, getting a multitudes of input from different people, different perspectives, and then knowing what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
There's an emotional load that comes with that.
Decision fatigue, kind of, where you're collecting so much information.
Yeah. Also, like, everyone has an opinion, but then it's on you to make the decision, obviously. Being in the middle, especially middle managers, managing your values versus the values of the organization, and
Mm-hmm.
having those be well connected when you work for a place that you aren't aligned to their values, and then you have to live those, or you are representative of those, that can wear us down, and become a bigger load for us to carry.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So what are some of the things leaders can do to deal with these stressors? Like if I'm lonely at the top and that influences my behavior and how good I or how well I am developing relationships, what can I do about that?
Well, the first thing is to understand that you're not broken for feeling that way, that that is actually pretty common. It's well documented. The more we know about what the risks are, the less self-judgment and self-criticism we'll potentially experience because we know that we're not alone in
Mhm.
what we feel, right? Imposter syndrome is very common. Perfectionism is very common. If you feel that as a leader, that doesn't mean you're broken. That just
Mhm.
means that you're experiencing something that lots of people have experienced and that lots of people have come with coping mechanisms and that those have been established on what actually works in those instances. So the number one thing that people can do is as a leader is focus on what are their needs and are they having those needs met? And are they understanding how they respond when they're under stress?
That's so interesting. I just had a coaching client call right before my LinkedIn live with you. And we were talking about this very thing about the idea that he said, dual personality. He's a CFO for a global billion-dollar technology company. And he was talking about this dual personality that he has a version at work and a version at home. And we talked about how we all have that, but we're needing to merge that a little bit more, especially welcome to my house, right? And
Exactly.
so there's a lot, and just with technology, I can text you at 11 o'clock at night now if I'm that kind of a boss. I'm not, but and so he actually said, I appreciate you saying that because I always kind of thought it was my own thing, but thanks for kind of reminding me that we all feel that and we do
Yeah.
all have a bit of a dual personality, and
Yeah.
that in and of itself is stressful because you're kind of playing a character. So we
Yeah.
talked
It's actually,
about,
there's a term for that called masking.
okay.
Yeah. So what we're doing is we're trying to be what we believe a manager, a professional person would look like.
Hmm.
That may or may not overlay in the Venn diagram of who we really are when we're
Yeah.
not paying attention.
Yeah.
And that can be, depending on how much you have to stretch, that can be very emotionally draining and exhausting.
Hmm.
Um, the number one thing I hear when I present on this topic is, I thought it was just me. So it's funny that your client said that because that's pretty much I can put down a bet that I'm going to hear. Oh, I thought I was the only one, and
Yeah.
that's the dysfunction we're trying to break down with our work. Is you aren't the only one.
Hmm.
This is your brain doing what it was designed to do, what evolved for 200,000 years to do. And
Hmm.
here are some tools that have been proven over and over and over to make that easier for you.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, Stanley from Italy says hello and thanks for our time to this conversation. So Stanley, feel free to ask some questions.
Wow.
I come from the world of communication and used to teach interpersonal communication in college, and often emotion work is what we called it in that particular field, similar to what you're saying. And I think that referred a little more to, for example, maybe I had a horrible fight this morning with my spouse and I have to tuck that away because I can't bring that to work. So while we want to be the same person all of the time as much as possible, there's also a time and a place. And so I've been talking a lot about vulnerability even before COVID, related to things like, harassment and workplace bullying, that if you want employees to tell you about that, HR, you need to have a vulnerable culture where people feel okay to be vulnerable. And I think that speaks to it too. So maybe if I did have a horrible fight, I didn't. I'm going through a divorce. I don't even have a spouse. But just use that as an
You
example.
did, and now
I
you're
once
done.
had a horrible fight in the morning. Uh, but even that, I'm going through a divorce. It's not pretty. So do
But
I
the
have?
fact that you even shared that, because
Yeah.
you're a human being with a life, right?
Right.
That we're not
Right.
pretending like I am not a human being. And this experience, I read a study about how this is women in STEM and how they responded with having all of a sudden people come into their homes.
Oh,
right?
uh-huh.
Because we put on this mask of being professional. So,
Yeah.
you were talking about your dog was walking by, and we're like, oh, the terror of you knowing that I have a pet. Like,
Yeah. And that people might hear it.
people might hear. So, or people blurring their background or turning their camera off because they don't want to be seen, literally making themselves invisible. So all of these things have come up. What you
Yeah.
talk about with vulnerability, I would describe as being psychologically safe,
Yes.
according to the research, right? So
Yes.
is creating a place where I can be my authentic self without fear of repercussion.
Right.
And that's easy to say, but difficult to do. Also, what's critical to psychological safety is not just how we behave, but it's also, do we have the structures and processes in place in our organization that will either hinder or help
Right.
psychological safety? So one of the ones that I use often is about role clarity. So
Mm.
if you're doing work and I'm doing work and they overlap, the stress of who owns what, I
Mhm.
thought I was doing that. I mean, that whole thing, especially depending on the culture,
Mhm.
that has been, again, proven over and over and over again to create undue mental health
And
harm.
actually, ambiguity is found over and over and over again to be the number one, what am I, situation correlated with engaging in bullying behavior. So
Yep.
ambiguity is directly tied to that behavior. And I see that all the time in my coaching, where often this person has been asked to make a bunch of changes and people don't like that change and they have to make it. And so they're out on an island
Absolutely.
alone. Yeah, right. And so it's true. And I think, just kind of going back to my example of the divorce, like I'm open about it, but I also can't, there does have to be a line, right? Because I can't be at work like, but I do, my team is fairly small, and I think I wear my heart on my sleeve, so it makes it easy for my team to share as well. But so I know that this is a place where maybe we cross over a bit, because we do a lot of training for that middle management group to help them become more vulnerable or create psychological safety, and give them some tips for how to go about doing that. I'm curious, what are some of your tips for anybody, any leader or manager, around opening up and creating psychological safety?
Yeah, so I like to make complex things really simple. So what we've
Do
implemented is
it.
the same way you respond if you're on fire physically, which is
Mhm.
what? If I'm on
Stop, rock,
fire,
and roll.
that's right. So I do the same thing if I'm on fire inside.
Hmm.
So what I do is I pause. So we call them smoke signals. Like there are different ways to see that I'm in a reactive mode or
Hmm.
where I'm going down as an unhelpful way. If I'm going through divorce, I probably need to stop, drop and roll before I walk in the door because I need to make that switch. So when we stop, we can pause, we can check in. Are there biases? Are there stress responses? Are there different things coming up for me? And then
Mhm.
I can get back connected to, well, what are my values and my goals? So what's my goal today as a leader? My
Mhm.
goal today as a leader is not to have everybody on my team make me feel better. My
Mhm.
goal today as a leader is to give everyone direction. And if I get distracted because I'm worried about what's happening at home, that's okay. I'm not going to judge myself, which is the other piece we get to.
Yeah.
I'm going to practice self-compassion. I'm going to accept this is hard. This transition is hard, and give myself some space. So that helps me then roll forward,
Mhm.
because I'm focused on what my values and goals are, and I have those activities I decide to take as a result.
Yeah. And I think it kind of circles back, because if I was vulnerable with my team and told them this is what's going on, then they might give me a little grace, which my team definitely has, because there have definitely been days or even weeks where I was fairly distracted and trying to get stuff done, but not being my best self. And for them to make comments like, I notice you're back to yourself, or you're, like, this version of you is the version I know you are. And so great to see that version today, so then we become more supportive of each
That's
other. I'm
right.
like getting emotional talking about this.
Well, but what's great about that is, again, your values, your goal isn't to have that. Your goal is to get the team focused on the outcomes, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a byproduct of you being transparent and clear and comfortable with yourself, that you're
Yeah.
not going to beat yourself up later for having shared it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you asked about the tools for leaders. The number one tool that I recommend is self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So and that is speaking to ourselves like we would a close friend or a loved one. And that can be transformational for leaders, because if I'm constantly holding myself up to this bar of perfection, uh,
Mhm.
of what I believe other people do, unrealistic goals, I'm going to constantly be disappointed. And so, look, we're going to mess up sometimes. We're on all the time. That means that's plenty of opportunities to get it right, plenty of opportunities to get it wrong. But as
Mhm.
long as we can practice self-compassion, what the data shows and what the neuroscience shows is when we practice self-compassion and speaking to ourselves with kindness, we actually activate the nurturing and positive affect parts of our brains. So we're better able to care for and be empathetic with others
Mhm.
when we are empathetic with ourselves.
And it's interesting because it's so hard. By the way, we have people watching from more Italy, Dubai, Chicago, UK. Thanks all for joining. Feel free to ask questions. We're talking about resiliency. We're talking about leadership. We're talking about creating psychological safety. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll make sure we answer those. Why are we so hard on ourselves? Why is the
Well,
person in our head so mean?
yes. So, number one, this was a big aha for me, because I actually argued with somebody about this when I was dealing with my own burnout recovery. Of, I can be kind to myself. If I'm nice to myself, I will lose my edge.
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
convinced that if I let up for a minute, everything would just bluff, right?
Mhm.
Um, so untrue. So untrue. So, why are we so difficult on ourselves? Several reasons. Number one, for 200,000 years, our brains evolved to keep us safe.
Mhm.
Therefore, we have a negativity bias.
Mhm.
The work we do now is such a small sliver of time for our monkey brains that it doesn't really, we have the same response to a negative email that we do from a tiger jumping from the bushes. Like the
Right.
threat, our brain doesn't know the difference. So we're working with a brain that has that wiring. That's
Mhm.
one. Two, for many of us, we went through school for decades, or maybe some of us got out earlier, but that is a place of judgment and being evaluated and being
Mhm.
told what you got wrong, and like staying in line and following norms and all of the things. And so as we grow in that space, we've become accustomed
Mhm.
to not not making mistakes, because our grades will go down. And
Right.
so that mindset, just it all comes with us. And then if you've had any kind of trauma or any kind of experience in your life, all of that comes with you too. And so you can't, it's funny, people will say, oh, I'll just turn that off, or it's just business, it's not personal. But we only have the one brain, and that one brain, it compartmentalizing it isn't, it's kind of like multitasking, it's not
Mhm.
actually real.
Mhm.
It's still there and it's going to come out. So how we learn to understand and accept that is the better off we'll be.
Mhm. That makes sense. That makes sense. It's interesting how much we've evolved over time. We're losing our appendix, but our reptilian brain is still
That's
very
right.
much
But the amygdala is firing off.
and I use a lot of that in my coaching. That's exactly what we talk about, that
Yeah.
that bullying behavior, which I specialize in coaching people who bully or leaders who bully, does come up from a place of fear around making mistakes, fear around judgment, wanting to appear as very competent, which
It's
we can all relate
control.
to. Yeah,
The
control.
attempt to grab control.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we talk a lot about, well, look, you're anxious and it's showing up in fight, and then everybody else is anxious interacting with you, not to mention everything else they're anxious about, because we all operate from there, and they're fleeing.
Yeah.
So that's the crux of the
Yep.
coaching. So I'm curious about your thoughts on bullying and leadership. Where do you think it comes from?
So one, we don't, most organizations don't invest a lot in developing their leaders,
Right.
right? So we just take people who are really good at X, and we then have them go and do a totally different job called Y that manages the people who do X.
Hmm.
And so we don't equip them how to do Y. And so
Hmm.
then what do? Okay, I have to emulate what I see, and what I see I either get from like parenting, teaching, other leaders. I'm just pulling together the best I can. I've
Hmm.
not been taught about any of these things we've just spoken about, so I feel like that's something I should just go ahead and just shove down and I don't really know what else to do. And
Yeah.
so to me, it's kind of when you have abusive families that then raise people who abuse. I don't know any other way to behave, right? And
Mhm.
so I think it comes from that. I do think it comes from a place of fear. To me, the strongest voice is usually the weakest person,
Mhm.
and inside, and so it's a protection defense mechanism. I
Mhm.
also like to work with people who aren't fitting in. I like the outcasts. I can relate to them.
Mm.
And also, they have the most to win, right? They have the
Mhm.
most opportunity. Nobody goes to work. Very few people go to work wanting to be that person. So either they don't know they're doing it or they don't know what else to do.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I found too, that they're usually lacking a lot of self-esteem and confidence, and so they overcompensate by, well, if I interrupt everyone and I'm the loudest at the meeting, then people will see me as the smartest or the most competent. So I definitely see that. I've also found, I think you're kind of saying this too, that they've always been fighting for something, whether it was love from a parent or I coached, I use her a lot as an example, a doctor who at the time when she was in medical school, she was the only woman in class. So she had something to prove. And she was a single mom of three. So she had something to prove there too. So she'd been fighting to prove she belonged and that, she was the competent one. And so, yeah, I hear that. It is interesting too, that after all this time, we all talk about how managers and leaders don't get the training on the people skills. Why are we still even talking about
I
this?
do
What
not
the heck?
know. I do not know because there's billions spent on leadership. Here's the thing, not a lot of it has worked, right? So
Right,
Gallup showed that 70% of leaders or 70% of people believe that their managers are terrible.
right,
And so whatever we're doing, it isn't working. My hypothesis is because we've been missing this part. Like, I
right.
think we can create a whole person who understands not just what everybody else needs, not the tactics of the work to be done, but also what do I need in order to be the best version of myself? What's the
Yeah,
how, right?
yeah, yeah.
And that I haven't, like I said, I hadn't seen that until with our program. That is what we build.
That's awesome. That's yeah, we got to help people understand what's going on in their brain and what they need, and then they can be good people managers, and
And
then
not from a
all the skills that go with that part too.
Exactly, like, so yeah, I can run a report, but if, I'm yelling at everyone or I'm stressing out about it or I've got perfectionism or there's all these biases, there's over 165 biases and distortions in how we see the world, and so if I'm not aware of that, then how am I gonna be able to overcome it?
Right, right. So, Manu, hopefully I said your name correctly, has a thought slash comment or question. At times, past memories or experiences just bounce back and they cause stress to a leader due to a current situation or experience that a leader might have faced as they're able to establish a connection, almost like a little PTSD. As
Yes,
this as a
absolutely.
consequence may impact their overall health. So, could we share our thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, the Surgeon General, U.S. Surgeon General, just came out literally hours ago with a framework on this exact thing. And, post traumatic stress has been well documented to be as a result of a negative work experience.
Hmm.
I have experienced it, especially if you've been on the receiving end of bullying,
Hmm.
um, toxic behaviors. I mean, we put our identity into work. We spend more time at work than we do doing anything else.
Yep.
It only makes sense that it impacts our mental health, and yet we've lived in a world where we pretend that that's not true.
Yep. I
And
mean,
so,
you can get PTSD at work from being abused, and you can get it at war. And I think that is very profound. And I don't know why that's not a headline at the top of a Forbes e-newsletter.
I mean, and context, um, 30% of the US population is actually experiencing signs of PTS, of post-traumatic stress following COVID. So we're
Okay.
walking around. I think I posted something earlier this week on we're flying down the freeway with the check engine light on, right? So
Mhm.
these things we try to pretend like they're not there, and they are.
Yeah, I like that metaphor, the check engine light.
I
I
did too.
I feel like that a lot.
No.
I have to
I
joke.
got
I
that and a
feel
flat
myself
tire
trying to
and
connect
some
when
like
they're not.
smoke.
Well, so we have another question. How do we get buy-in from leadership to work on this development? And HR talking about bullying may be perceived as a troublemaker when in reality we just want to contribute and minimize. I'd love to go first on that one. Sorry, you're my guest, but I'm taking the
You
lead
go
on
for
this
it.
because I
You go
feel
for
very
it.
strongly. So I too was that HR professional working in an organization where there was bullying, and I could not get the president to pay attention to it in the way that he needed. And it just lots of wasted time. And that's how I got into doing what I do. I saw firsthand how I felt about it and how it was affecting the organization. And this is the story I come across a lot when we go into coach. We're called in by HR, but the narrative is 99% of the time that HR has been trying to get the C-suite to allow HR to deal with this, or for the C-suite to deal with it with a lot of no, because they're a high performer, right? Because they're lacking confidence. So they outperform everyone and also create a lot of drama. And then HR is like, you got to fix this. And the C-suite says no, because they're such a high performer. This is probably your experience too,
Mhm. Yep.
Allessandria. And then, so usually there's some sort of catalyst where finally the C-suite gets slapped in the face with some sort of scenario. And finally HR has the opportunity to get some resources, and then they find us and we coach. But I think sometimes those HR professionals I talk to have a little bit of PTSD too, because they're experiencing guilt around not having been able to address it. So the answer is there isn't an answer. I'm sorry. But Alessandria, maybe you have an answer.
Well, I just want to grab that comment, Amy, about the HR team.
Yeah.
So, study came out this summer that showed that 98% of HR is burned out.
I bet.
So HR, if you're from HR, take care of yourself. There's 30 years worth of research about why we burn out in HR. And I say that as a former chief people officer who burned out. So, my flippant answer to this question is usually, if leaders don't get it by now, I'm just not going to waste my time trying to convince them, because there's just so much data. So McKinsey just came out with a report last week that showed that high stress, dysfunctional workplaces are 73% more likely to go bankrupt in the next 2 years.
Ooh,
So there is
we
data.
need to post that link after
Yeah,
the show, please.
I will. So and on our website, we actually have a dedicated page called Make the Case, where you can put in, based on all the research, you can put in, based on your industry, et cetera, the ROI to investing in this work, based on, lost time, et cetera. So again, if the Surgeon General says that we need to pay attention to this, if the World Health Organization says we need to pay attention to this, I don't really know what else to tell you at that point, right? So it's kind of pretty obvious what needs to be done. There's very clear frameworks, of what to do, how to go after it. It's the same as saying, well, I don't believe in giving people bump caps or safety vests. I didn't have one growing up, and I never got hit by a car.
Right.
It's the same.
Right. And I agree with you. So yes, you have to make a business case. I'll have to check that out on your website. I love that. We definitely have a lot of research too, and our proposals often, they have a lot of that, so that can help make the case. And I think sometimes too, depending on your relationship with the leader, you could even just ask, have you ever worked back in your career, did you ever feel mistreated, and how did that affect you? And maybe get them to see that and recollect that it affected their productivity, and maybe they quit because back when they were 18 they worked for a horrible boss and they decided to quit. And sometimes that's a great way to go about it too. And
that is a great idea.
Yeah. And then also just open up a blank Excel sheet and start typing in the numbers. Let's see, I've spent this many hours on this problem. This is my salary broken into an hourly rate. So just me alone, this is how much you've spent. And if you can create, because I agree, there's so much data and there isn't a leader on this planet who can claim they didn't know they should be focused on burnout because it's everywhere. But sometimes those grandiose numbers of, like APA, the American Psychological Association, says we spend like $480 billion on stress. Well, that's hard to really, not in my little company of 10 people or whatever. But if you can really say, look, here is the real cost in our organization, that can be really helpful too.
And it's not just about cost, it's also about limited productivity, right? So we know that you have a decrease in quality, you have a decrease in customer service. You just said you waste time, you have underperformance. All of these things happen when you don't have a healthy workplace. And so it's not just about the cost, it's about the lost opportunity as well.
Yeah. And it's a shame that we even have to have this conversation. It
Also,
seems
yes.
you should go to your leader and say, people are hurt and their check engine light's on, and that your leader will go, oh my gosh, let's fix that. But often it is, you have to prove the numbers. So anyway, we are definitely at time. Someone's asking about the recorded version, and I'm going to try to say your name because I think it's important. Urush, but I'm sure I butchered that, but I just wanted you to know I tried. And you can access it right here on this page. It will sit here forever. So you can watch it from now until the rest of your life. And Allessandria, thank you so much for, this was a really great conversation. I loved it. So thank you. And we got a lot of great comments from people saying they really needed to hear this today. So that's awesome. So thank you.
Help. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Bye all. We'll see you next week.